Chapter 2. Charlie Ward's death made the national news only hours after it had happened, although few people noticed. They were too caught up in watching the brilliant dazzle of color exploding above them in celebration of Independence Day. The anchorman on one major network called Charlie Ward's death a bizarre accident. Another referred to it as a rain of death from the sky. But Jenna Ward did not watch the news that night. Fred Campbell, the family's physician, concerned about the effect that the barrage of firecrackers and cherry bombs in the neighborhood would have on Jenna and her mother, had given them each a sedative and sent them to bed. They had slept through the entire night, unaware of the reporters stalking below their bedroom windows. The Briarwood police had cordoned off the area, stretching yellow tape across the front yard to ward off morbid spectators. Dave Zielinski, the local police chief, had stationed police officers round the clock at the scene of the accident, and so it was that Jenna, her head dulled from the aftermath of the sedative, peered out her bedroom window on the following morning to see a police officer standing at the end of her driveway. That was how she knew the nightmare of the day before had really happened. Outside, the July sun was just spilling over the rooftop of the church across the street. Without checking her clock, Jenna knew it was early, probably no later than 6, as she watched the police officer take a thermos from his car and pour himself a cup of coffee. She wondered what she should be feeling, because the truth was, she felt nothing. Below, on the roof of the front porch, a tight line of mourning doves had gathered. They sat as rigid as little gray soldiers, their feathers pressed so close together that Jenna thought if one flew off, they would all be lifted into the air in a long silver rope of birds. For a long time she watched the birds, because she did not know what else to do. Then she rummaged through one of her drawers for a pair of shorts and a top, dressed indifferently, and wandered into the bathroom to brush her teeth. She splashed cold water on her face and reached for a towel. The unmistakable scent of her father's Royal Copenhagen aftershave rushed up to greet her. He had used this towel, probably only the day before. She held the towel in her hand for a few minutes, then folded it neatly and hung it on the rack, as if she were expecting him to use it later. Barefoot, her dark blonde hair still a tangled mess, she descended the stairs. The house seemed unusually large and silent, but it smelled the same. An odor of rose petal potpourri, strategically placed in bowls and baskets in every room by her mother. The odor had never seemed so overpowering before. It made her gag. The kitchen was no better. She took the basket of rose petals from its place on the counter and dumped the contents into the trash compactor. Her mother would be furious. Jenna shrugged at the thought. So what else was new? She reached for the tea kettle, filled it with water, and put it on to boil. It was all so odd, she thought. Here she was, calmly going about her morning routine as if nothing had changed. She felt as if she were standing outside herself, watching as she opened the small white envelope and pulled out the tea bag, watching as she set it in a mug, watching for her hand to shake, which it never did, not so much as a tremor. She poured the boiling water and added a pack of sugar substitute, all very matter-of-factly. While she waited for the tea to steep, she studied the list of chores that her mother had made up for her father and taped to the refrigerator door. The list was an old joke between her parents. Her father had called it the honey-do list. At the top of the list, underlined twice, was patch leak in roof. Jenna lifted the magnetic pencil from the drawer and crossed off that first item. When her tea was ready, she picked up the mug and carried it down to the basement. In the far corner was her father's workshop. She knew she had come here on purpose. The smell of sawdust was as powerful a reminder as his aftershave. She set the mug on the workbench and positioned herself on his stool. The metal rung bit into the arches of her bare feet. She looked around the workshop. This had been her father's sacred place. He had loved nothing better than to spend a few hours on weekends building things. Jenna lifted a hammer from the bench, turning it over and over in her hand, feeling its weight. Her father had never spent as much time down here as he'd wanted. His life had been an endless round of meetings and negotiations. He had been in upper management at AT&T for as long as she could remember. She set the hammer down, reached for her mug of tea, and blew into the rising steam. Usually her father would be halfway to his office by now, and in some strange way it seemed as if he were on his way to work, just like any other day. At 6 o'clock that evening or thereabouts, he would come bounding through the front door, fly up the stairs, grab his swim trunks, and make a mad dash for the pool in the backyard, just as he had done every night in the summer. That was the reality. It had always been the reality. Jenna could not make herself believe otherwise. Yes, the ambulance had come. Yes, the attendants had strapped her father to a gurney. And yes, the blood from the wound in the back of his head had leaked onto the white sheet. But that didn't mean he was dead, did it? She stared down at the floor. Small piles of sawdust littered the area like anthills. Her father had rarely bothered to sweep it up. He'd liked it on the floor. She dug into one of the piles with her big toe, suddenly aware that she had her ear cocked toward the staircase, listening for her father's footsteps. But when the footsteps came, they were lighter, quicker, and Jenna knew that her mother was overhead in the kitchen. The basement door clicked open. "Jenna, are you down there?" Her mother's voice was like the crash of cymbals coming at the end of a lullaby. It was always like that these days. Jenna's body grew rigid, a simple reflex action. She sat silent and motionless. "I need you up here." There was a brief pause. "Now." Couldn't her mother leave her alone for even a minute? Just a few minutes alone to try to understand this terrible thing that was happening to them? Jenna took a swallow of her tea and tried to remember if she was even talking to her mother this week. They had so many fights over the past few years, spent so many weeks barely speaking to each other, that she found it hard to keep track. She stared down at the mug in her hand. The tea had become lukewarm. She shouldn't be behaving like this. She had lost her father. Her mother had lost her husband. They should be trying to comfort each other, not bite each other's heads off. Reluctantly, she slid off the stool and padded up the stairs to the kitchen, where she found her mother, a bottle of Fantastic in one hand and a wad of paper towels in the other, frantically wiping down the stove. Her mother nodded toward the vacuum cleaner in the dining room. Jenna blinked, but did not move. Surely her mother didn't expect her to vacuum the carpet. Meredith Ward tossed the clump of soggy wet paper towels into the trash compactor and pulled another handful from the roll next to the sink. "Mom?" Jenna found she could not finish her thought because she didn't know what it was she wanted to say. Her mother was staring down at the bottle of Fantastic in her hand as if she were trying to remember where it had come from. She set the container on the counter, wiped her hands on her yellow shorts, and tucked the loose strands of her hair much like Jenna's, only shorter, back into the wide barrette at the nape of her neck. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee. "People will be coming to the house," she said. "We have to get organized." She looked over the rim of her coffee mug at her daughter's face, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. "I'm sorry, Jen. I wish I knew a way to make this easier for you, for both of us, but I don't." She set the mug back on the counter without taking a swallow. "We have to get through this somehow. People will be coming to the house, and it's a mess. I'm counting on you." Jenna stared over at the vacuum cleaner. Suddenly it was just like any other morning, especially those Saturday mornings when she wanted to go to the mall with her friends, and her mother insisted she stay home and help her with the housework. Those Saturday mornings almost always ended in a screaming match. "Nobody's going to care if the house is a mess." Jenna sucked in the sides of her mouth, a habit she had acquired as a small child when she was upset. Then, as if she needed to test the words, she whispered, "Good Lord, Mom, Daddy's dead." She waited to see if saying this out loud would somehow make it more real. It didn't. "Nobody's going to notice the lint on the carpet." Their eyes locked. Her mother seemed to be holding her breath. Then, without a word, she grabbed a bottle of soft scrub from under the sink and left the room. That was when Jenna understood that her mother did not believe what was happening to them any more than she did. Jenna sat down cross-legged on the floor next to the vacuum cleaner, her hand resting on the cool plastic as if she were stroking a family pet. Well, fine. Her mother could soft scrub the bathroom towels until her fingers bled, but Jenna would not be a part of it. In the end, though, Jenna vacuumed, not only every rug in the house, but all the upholstered furniture and all the bedspreads and drapes. The work kept her busy, and she didn't have to think, which, much as she hated to admit it, might have been just what her mother had in mind. By the time Chief Zielinski arrived to take their statements, the house was spotless.